So good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. Welcome to our webinar series on energy data and the supply chain. BEAMA and Foot Anstey, I think, have been looking for ways to collaborate for a number of years now, and we've done a few small things here and there, but this is just a really, really exciting development, and we're honoured and very pleased to be working with Foot Anstey on this. There's so much to say about what we want to try to get from this, and that will, I think, become clear as we proceed. So I'm not going to give you chapter and verse on it now. For those of you who don't know, my name's Jeremy Yap. I head the Flexible Energy Systems quarter of BEAMA, which is the most interesting part of what we do. BEAMA is the UK trade association for manufacturers and providers of energy infrastructure, technologies and systems. So we represent more than 200 companies, from startups and SMEs up to large multinationals. Our members provide generation, transmission and distribution equipment, heating and ventilation products, EV infrastructure, electrical systems and flexibility assets in networks and in the built environment. My fun part is the built environment stuff. I mostly do metering and behind the meter flexibility. In all of that, we promote regulation and markets and products that support a safe, smart and secure low carbon energy system. So a little housekeeping just before I pass over to Chris. Just please use your chat and Q&A tabs. You should find them at the bottom of your screen. We will keep an eye on both, and we will answer or address as many as possible. And those we don't get to, we will read them. We'll read them twice. We'll use these comments and questions to inform the structure and content of the forthcoming sessions. So I just want to thank you again all for joining, and pass to my friend Chris Pritchett from Foot Anstey, who will take us through.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you. My name is Chris Pritchett. I'm head of energy at Foot Anstey LLP. We're a law firm, but don't let that put you off. We're sort of deeply involved in the sort of energy transition conversation, and particularly on the sort of data that glues it all together and makes it all work. How did we come by this sort of strange interest? I think it was born out of actually doing legal work with contracts for energy storage, particularly battery storage. And it became quite clear that there was a real grey area as to who had control over the data the batteries were outputting, or the sort of the dispatch control. And we started arguing about that with various parties. And I think then from that was born this kind of Beach Boys-esque revelation that said, wouldn't it be nice if these all talked to itself and the system, and wouldn't that be efficient, and wouldn't it be quite great if the system knew what the batteries were and where the state of charge were, and how it could all work, and wouldn't that be efficient, and wouldn't it save a load of money? Which point my then marketing team went, well, that sounds like a briefing, you should do a briefing. And so we did a little note on effectively the use of data in the energy storage system, which was really interesting, but it just started getting us into the open data conversation, and about how that would bring enormous efficiency and an enormous saving. It sort of required a different structure, a different mindset. So it was only a sort of, a few pages, but luckily for me, I came to Laura's attention, and Laura at that point had done the first sort of reshaping regulation paper, or it was about to be launched, or it was around the same sort of time, and it was clear that we had a similar view of things, and a similar view of what the direction of travel should be, and that was wonderful. So that conversation then led to the opportunity to get involved with the Energy Data Taskforce, which was an absolutely phenomenal and fascinating period, for which I'm extremely grateful. And although I'm not sort of from a technical background, I was able to provide a little bit of the legal context and some of the legal issues with requiring data sharing. And I think that, comes down to regulatory frameworks, it comes down to confidentiality, people's intellectual property, but also people's privacy and people's data rights as individuals. So clearly anything that takes us along a road of moving towards open data and towards data sharing has to be done in a way that protects the interests of individuals and commercial interests. But I believe that was very much at the core of what we were trying to do. And it's been fantastic to see how the findings of the Energy Data Taskforce have been taken on board by government, by Ofgem, by BEIS, and really started a very meaningful period of transition and a hugely exciting move forward as we get towards a data system and an energy system that is increasingly decentralized and digitized and distributed. And it's an enormous challenge. And I certainly don't want to steal any of Laura's thunder at all, but very early on in the process when we met, she was describing to me her experience of the food network and how the supply chain works in food, very much all about just-in-time delivery, the right amount of food to where it's needed within hours, and a very highly sort of granular, highly controllable sort of supply chain system. And by comparison, we were stuck in the dark ages in the energy system and had an awful long way to go. And with that in mind, that was quite inspirational, because it sort of, you know, we deal with quite a lot of dynamic tech-focused people, and we kind of assume in a way that we're energy professionals and we're really clued up on this stuff. And I think it was very clear that we had a lot to learn from other industries and the way they do it. And that was one of the really fascinating things for me, was to see what the wider world was doing and the conversations that they'd already had, be it from transport or financial services or from or indeed from sort of the food supply chain as well. So there is a lot to learn, and I think that's probably a good place to start from the when looking at energy system data, a certain humility about where our starting point is, but also that creates a huge opportunity to improve. So without any further ado, it's delightful to have Laura with us today. I'll let Laura introduce herself, but very grateful for her joining, and it would be fantastic to hear from her a bit more about how the Energy Data Taskforce came about, where it's going, and really exciting stuff about what's happening now and what it's led to and what's in progress. So I will pass you over, and Laura, love to see you. And it'd be lovely to hear you as well. I think you may be on mute still.
Hi.
There we are. Hi.
Sorry.
There we are.
Chris, thank you so much. And you were very, very important and instrumental on the steering group of the Energy System Data Task Force. And I also wanted to say thank you to BEAMA. In many ways, what's happening and this transition is a real opportunity for your members, and for, in many ways, capturing some of, in many ways, the lost opportunities within the energy sector that data and digitalization really offer. So I'm really pleased to be here, and it's great to have your members at this webinar. So thank you to both Foot Anstey and BEAMA. I run a little sort of self-generated company called Challenging Ideas, and it's sort of in the name, and it really does sort of talk to what Chris was saying. Is the sector is a wonderful sector, but my word, there is a lot to learn. There is a lot going on in other sectors that are further ahead than us, and I hopefully bring some of that knowledge from other sectors. But just to look at where we are in terms of where we're sitting today, we've got the old world, and I like my blind man's bluff on the left-hand side, because that really shows us where we are in terms of data and visibility of the system. But more interesting is really on the right-hand side, which is looking at where we're going. So in the old days, and even today, probably people like the ESO would know the first names and the golf handicaps of most people in the energy sector, right? We are now moving from, let's say, 200 reasonable players to millions, if we include EV cars, millions of actions, millions of products and assets, and also behavior, which is going to start to shape, meld, and in many ways transform the sector. Now, this is a world that the energy sector really is not actually equipped today to actually manage, and to ensure that there is stability at the heart of this, but also that there is opportunity for consumers. I always have to have a Monty Python, blessed are the cheesemakers. But also, and I know a lot of people on this panel are interested in the issue around location as well. So we have been costing a commodity, but we haven't been, in many ways, costing its location. And that's also going to offer lots of opportunities for differential energy systems, depending whether you're in a city, whether you're in a town, a rural area. And that, again, is going to require data. So I was going to give you a very quick recap of where we are in terms of the Data Task Force. What our aim was, our vision of a modern digitalized infrastructure, and it's infrastructure, it's not energy per se, it is all of it working together, was that we required data visibility. And that would then give us, as Chris rightly talks about in terms of storage, etc., it would give us the opportunity to in some ways map and understand where this infrastructure sits, where the assets are, and in many ways sort of give us that map. And we've drawn a bit on Australia for that, because they've got a very, very good energy asset mapping system. But where is the exciting stuff? The exciting stuff is actually in the operational optimization. And that is about the flow of how those assets work. But to be frank, those assets will sit in my home as well as in the North Sea. How do we optimize them? And how do we create the open markets that actually allow for the value to flow through this new system? Now, the Data Task Force was absolutely clear that this was absolutely the end point. But where we had to start from was not digitalization, it was data, because that's the feedstock. So I would be very, very clear with you that the Data Task Force was there to unlock the feedstock, the bloodstream of digitalization, but it is absolutely the first step. So what did we say? We said that we needed to fill in the gaps and we needed to maximize the value. So digitalization was an absolute core requirement, and Ofgem have done a huge amount on this. Presumed open. My God, I thought, and I think Chris did as well, we wanted this because we felt it was incredibly important, particularly a lot of these assets, to be frank, we've paid for, right? So actually their data is my data, whether they be offshore wind, whether they be networks. But I have to say, we were a little bit cautious about going and saying, right, fine, everything is presumed open, expecting all those nice security people to come down on us. And I was both surprised and absolutely thrilled. We have got acceptance from all the people that we consulted that presumed open was absolutely crucial. And presumed open means a lot of things, so it is not about just open data. And that has been incorporated. But I wanted just very quickly to recap on where we've got to since the report. The report was published, BEAMA and Ofgem absolutely endorsed all of it and have already started doing things. And those things with little pink boxes, my favorite color, are actually featuring what has happened. So on digitalization, the RIIO-2 process has required digitalization strategies of all the networks. The requirement that data will be open, a huge amount of focus on continuous improvement, and the requirement for new data. Now, because some people think it's a regret that we're a very regulated sector, one of the great things about being a very heavily regulated sector is when the regulator says you have to do something, it sort of happens. So in many ways, we've got an advantage in that sense. So Ofgem have been doing a huge amount on that. On the right side is the presumed open. And through Innovate, BEAMA and Ofgem, there's a lot of interesting innovation money, which I'm sure some of your BEAMA customers would be interested in. Structures, interfaces and standards. The discoverable, searchable and understandable will be delivered by the data catalogue, which is also proceeding pretty effectively. And the ONS are doing a beta version of this, which will be the platform by which all data will become visible, using metadata standards that will actually allow you to discover, search and understand. In addition, the ENA, the Energy Networks Association, is pushing forward on the digital system map, and that is about that asset visibility, very much based on the Australian element. The asset registration strategy, which I think is absolutely crucial, is taking a bit longer. Did you know there were 41 places where you could register an energy asset, all of which are totally siloed with no interoperability? So this has got to be addressed, and we will be addressing it. But weirdly, me and the team at the Energy Systems Catapult, who are really the brains behind this, absolutely believe that we might actually reject the recommendation that we made and come up with an even more modern one. So more interesting, and I will be very short on this, but the real prize is not the data, but it is the digitalization. And the data is merely the sort of the platform onto which we do this. And so myself and some of my colleagues are looking to do a next stage. And that is, what are the real digital tools here? And so I've got a vision. We've got digital infrastructure, which absolutely has to now be integral. I don't believe any asset should be either commissioned, should be allowed planning, allowed any form of acceptance without being absolutely at the front end of connectivity and interoperability. And we'll be looking at product and infrastructure standards on that. I'm absolutely excited about, in many ways, self-identification of assets. So as you go into your home with a new piece of equipment, the Wi-Fi automatically connects into the system that you've got. These are absolutely, they're very, very cheap in many ways, products and services. This is something that we should be looking at, which actually supersedes our registration platform, because in many ways, the infrastructure should self-identify and self-communicate. I'm excited on the consumer side because I think we can start with prices to devices. Again, in many ways, bypassing some of the current structures within the energy sector that is in many ways the aggregators, the arbitrators of my relationship, whether I be a C&I client or whether I be a domestic customer. On system stability, I have a vision for the ESO, and that the ESO actually becomes, in some ways, a software platform by which location, by which assets, by which all sorts of different systems can actually start to communicate, but also where we can start looking at system operation, not just at that central level, but at all multi-levels. And I'm also quite interested in what the telecom sector has done in terms of energy storage, in terms of cloud. And Iberdrola is doing some really exciting storage propositions in Spain. And I think that, again, that is a way of data and digitalization offering the opportunity to share assets. But fundamentally, digitalization is not an add-on. It is actually transformative. And I think we've got to see into the future, as we look at the digitalization of the system, there will be winners and there will be losers, but there will be fundamental change. And whether our sector looks quite the same in 8 years' time with the same players, I doubt. In some instances, I hope not as well, because I think, as Chris says, we've got a huge amount to learn and a huge amount to learn from other sectors who've gone through this. Thank you very much. You're on mute.
Just I know that's the catchphrase of 2020 is I'm on mute. Laura, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. There's actually quite a bit I'd love to ask you about as well. I suppose, given we're here with BEAMA to talk about effectively the supply chain, I think there's a this is a leading question, Your Honour, but we sort of talk a little bit about how a lot of this is going to need structures and interfaces and standards. And I think that is the common language, I guess, through which, you know, the devices will integrate with the digital system at local and, of course, at system level as well. I suppose that will clearly be of interest to BEAMA and its membership as well. But to what extent do you think that it's also a little bit of a mindset change here as well? It's not just about, we're going to put some rules on how you do things. Here's a protocol-based approach, but actually a little bit of an understanding that in order to deliver value to the customer in this new world, then the manufacturers and supply chain will need to kind of be open to that integration and that free flow of information and be part of that ecosystem at a local level.
No, I mean, I absolutely think it does need a mind shift. But I mean, I don't know BEAMA's membership in total detail, but I'm sure that they're also working in other sectors, and maybe they can be agents of change, looking at how other sectors utilize digitalized models, how assets are optimized, etc. And I think, in a strange way, I think it's those people who own some of the modernizing dynamics of transformation who might be important and actually squeeze out some of the incumbents. So whether in some ways the BEAMA members become the energy suppliers because actually the suppliers are less relevant in a much more prices to devices direct environment, I don't know. I know that everyone within the sector is going to be challenged by this and needs to step up and in many ways start to add value to the commodity that has in many ways been very vanilla up until now. I think when we look at standards, I think that they need to evolve. Innovate UK is actually putting out a lot of tenders, £2 million worth of Innovate money to actually look at the interfaces and interoperability. But I think we should be learning from other sectors, not just in some ways with a blank sheet of paper, looking at the energy sector for those standards.
Indeed, and I guess with interoperability in the EV space, we've got ISO 15118 or 15 numbers of some description like that. That is for me, I guess, sort of EV almost the bridge from the energy system into people's homes to a certain extent, and perhaps that kind of level of interoperability needs to then sort of permeate across the whole of the domestic interaction. The other question I wanted to ask you just from your presentation, Laura, was talking about the Netflix model, and you know. I'm sort of probably moving to thinking about subscription and sort of on-demand type of play, and hopefully not a system that says when you turn an appliance off, your next appliance will start in 5, 4, 3, 2, and then it takes you into the sequel. But yeah, perhaps you could just bring that a bit more detail on what you think by that mean.
I think there are 2 points there. One point was what we were looking at in terms of the future, and the Netflix model is actually to do with localized storage. So caches are set up in a very distributed way. So the most popular Netflix box set is distributed across a whole raft of different distribution centers because you therefore reduce congestion.
Yeah.
If we look at network congestion, certainly when it comes to data, they're much further ahead of us in terms of constraint management, etc. And Netflix is one of them. But I think you bring up a very important point, and that is about the service economy. And hey presto, I'm writing a report at the moment which is saying we need to move from a commodity to a service proposition. And that in many ways starts to drive suppliers, right way through the supply chain, to optimize and increase in many ways the productivity of the system, because it's not more is more, i.e. more commodity is more money. It's actually more service might mean less commodity.
Indeed.
So start to drive productivity within the system.
Look forward to that report coming out. I think we'll all want a copy of that. Laura, thank you so much. There's a lot going on in the chat box complimenting your work, and there's actually a specific question in the Q&A tab, if I may. Chris, can I go ahead? I'm
going to pick that up actually, if I can, just because it flows from exactly that conversation we're having about moving to a service-based proposition. And Paul from EA Technology was saying, you know, the digitalization and the data flow is starting to come, but what about the market development? How do we sort of create that value for commercial players within the industry and sort of, you know, because there are plenty of things as well that are a barrier at the moment. And does it need incentives, or does it need a stick of regulation, or a combination of both? So it's interesting, I guess, how does the commercial market evolve around this?
Well, I think that it has to start, I mean, at both ends, we need services. So weirdly, when we're looking at generation, the commodity is of less value. If you look at data, right, 1 terabyte of data was £1 million in 1970. It is now, I think, 5 cents, right? Actually, the commodity of energy is going to go through the same sort of revolution where it actually will have very, very little value. Right? So in some ways, what we need to do is to pay for the service of the asset that delivers us the commodity. Right? So on the generation side, we need a service-based model. Right way through, through storage, we're actually not seeing market. The market is not unlocking that investment, which is crucial, particularly into seasonal storage. Right? It is a service. It's not a commodity anymore. Right. Then at the consumer end, I mean, I was interested that I think Siemens and another joint venture has set up a commercial proposition, which is energy as a service. I think they launched that day before yesterday. Now, it's very difficult to deliver services in the retail sector because of the regulation. And we don't understand how to regulate for financial services, because actually that's what it is. It's a long-term service contract, possibly off the back of an EV car. But personally, I would like to see us, I would like to buy an EV car on a lease with 300 miles embedded. And actually, I don't really want to get involved in energy at all. So the service model would sit right the way through the supply chain, and actually the service at the retail end or at the customer end would be almost invisible, the energy component of it. What it would be is mobility, it would be warmth, it would be all of those sorts of the utility of energy rather than the commodity.
And I think that's exactly right. And I think Paul has echoed that in the chat as well, to say that, let's move to this service-based proposition. That's absolutely right. And I think we've already seen it, and Sarah can sort of jump in here, but the way in which energy is packaged with EV is packaged with something else, and we're going to see energy packaged with any number of things coming down the track, and ways to make it more and more straightforward for customers to access that service proposition along with whatever they're doing, and that is going to be hugely disruptive. But so coming back to how do we regulate that? I mean, you and I have talked before, and others will know, but is there a need to regulate that bundle of services that a customer is engaging with? And
personally, my very first report, we said we should regulate how consumers consume, not how businesses are organized. So when we start to look at the consumer proposition of a bundled home services product, I certainly don't want to have to navigate through Ofgem, Ofwat, Ofcom to get redress, to understand what the system looks like. I want one interface, which is the consumer side of essential services. And I think that Jeremy talked about off-bundle. There we go. Where actually the consumer protection side will become a little bit more complex, actually, and possibly needs a little bit more sophistication than we've got in the silos that we've currently got. But fundamentally, I need one port of call to manage my consumer redress when it comes to bundled products. And these silos, I mean, for example, energy and communications, I think are becoming one piece of infrastructure. I don't think they're separate, because neither works without the other. And so I think we're getting conflation right the way through the system.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I suppose the question that flows from that for me is how much does that change? If we regulate from the customer upwards and not from the power station downwards, it seems that a lot of our some of our discussions with Ofgem are about it has to put the customer first. But that then drives its whole overarching strategy to cost modelling and investment and decarbonisation and the necessary technological upgrades that it needs in order to deliver that decarbonised system. Whereas actually, if we sort of flip it around and start with what the customer is actually experiencing, and then in a way, does it disconnect, the CFD regime from the customer protection to an extent, or is it part of the same conversation?
Well, I think that fundamentally the customer has to be in many ways the sort of the core driver of all regulation. But the customer in some ways is still seen as a sort of victim in terms of regulation. So in many ways, what we're not doing, we're not designing it around the customer currently. What we're doing is we're designing the system to deliver to the customer. And I would turn it upside down and say that actually demand has as much value in the system as supply, and that we need to open up the demand markets much more effectively to allow for retailers to optimize my demand, because actually they're being paid a service rather than for a commodity. So if you get rid of this quantity issue and you look at the service issue, you start to optimize the whole supply chain. Because actually everybody wants to supply you less because that's how they make better margins, which means that they optimize the demand element of it, the customer, and that then starts to unlock real value. And we've seen it in the mobile market. We used to have sort of, you know, how many text messages you sent. All of that has disappeared, really, more or less. And now it's actually based around a product with a service package behind it. And whether it be EVs, PV, all sorts of different equipment, or service propositions, that, in my view, is the vision for the energy sector in the future.
Perfect. One more from me, and then I'm going to perhaps come back to Sarah, who pick up a question Jeremy has on asset registration, which is something else that's dear to our hearts. But you mentioned as well that this has landed well, it has been well received by the key stakeholders. And I think one of the sort of early challenges we were grappling with was actually whether BEIS could share information with Ofgem as a very starting point. And I think if you kind of almost took that as a microcosm of the problem, and but this has landed well, Laura, has it? And you're getting the buy-in and the momentum that you think it deserves.
I mean, I've been absolutely staggered, actually, because, well, I mean, I think, as you know, Chris, the way we did it was we brought people along a journey through the process. But at the end of it, I can't remember seeing both Ofgem and BEIS move quite as quickly on something for quite a long time. And the response in particular on the RIIO-2 process from Ofgem putting integrating digitalization into their requirements very, very quickly after we published, I think was a real reflection of their appetite around data and digitalization, and everyone's acceptance that this is something the energy sector is behind the curve on. We need to move fast. And I would say that digitalization has become one of the absolute core planks of the transformation. It's no longer a nice to have, it's actually an essential component. So I've been very, very well surprised.
Excellent. There's been plenty of other things going on they could have been distracted by. So that's excellent. Sarah, I think Jeremy's popped a question in the chat, which I think
he did. People do this. It's very sneaky. They have a chat, and actually, it's really a question. There was kind of two. There was another one I spotted from Tony Shorthouse from Plug-in Power. He was asking another attendee in the group, do you see a future where smart homes can manage white goods, heat pumps, EV chargers going forward? So let's tackle that one first, maybe a quick one.
I mean, personally, as I say, prices to devices, I will end up with, you know, all my equipment being smart and able to be self-managed, receive data, receive actions that will optimize it. I don't believe that consumers are going to be optimizing their energy consumption any day soon, other than the train spotters. And I think it's really about empowering and creating those product standards. I absolutely think product standards, white goods product standards, you know, EVs are pretty far ahead on this, but all sorts of other products need to be what I would call energy enabled. And once you get that, you then start to have different service propositions. So maybe Bosch, for example, would sell me a package of white goods, all of which would be energy enabled, all of which would be, let's say, a monthly service contract. And I would either consent or not consent. I'd probably get a higher price if I didn't consent to them to optimize my freezers and all my actions. I'm perfectly happy with that as long as my freezer is freezing, which it certainly is.
As long as it does.
I think that's the core proposition, I guess, with domestic DSR, is it does feel like there's a barrier of which people will need to be led, and that may be, well, as you say, by lower prices or even a, you know.
But I don't even know whether the consumer will be led. I think they will just buy these products with this service contract. And part of that service contract will be turning my freezer off at peak times. Now, my freezer and my food is never going to realize that they have had an hour's reduction in energy. So I have no impact on my service whatsoever.
Exactly. If
It's invisible to me.
Your fridge may drop half a degree, and that would create an aggregated response, and you can be that can just deliver it via your contract. Yeah. Jeremy also asks about, you know, wouldn't it be great if, wouldn't it be nice, back to the Beach Boys, if, you know, all of the assets in the built environment, be they white goods or data or energy, could all sort of have a unified point of registration and you know, lock into this energy enabled system in a sort of plug and play way. That's sort of what we're discussing, I think, in building level.
Absolutely. I mean, the point is, so again, if you've got an EV car, and I see there's somebody from Octopus EV on the line as well, so they'll know, but I think you have to register in 3 different places. If you are a small fitter of PV on somebody's roof, or, you know, large, you've got to register in another 3 places. This is absolutely ludicrous. First of all, we're not actually capturing it. But secondly, then what is it used for? Because the silos are maintaining barriers between and prohibiting visibility. So we most definitely need a platform that can in many ways assume or simulate. It's also, as we've seen through COVID, unbelievably important for system stability too. So, you know, it's not a nice to have. We've got to be able to, and that's why I think the ESO should become, in some ways, a software company, or create that software platform by which assets and visibility can be communicated, and operational activity, and that then starts to create automation. But fundamentally, we are going to have 100 million assets acting in this energy system. And if anybody thinks that it can be done by, hey, ramp it up, Johnny, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's a big control room. And this is it, we've always talked about it, it can't be done at some central repository, some centralized database based on an Excel spreadsheet that goes wrong. It's done at local level, and it's done in a distributed way at the edge, where the processing needs to be done and the analysis and the response needs to be done. Laura, I'm conscious of time. We've got you for another couple of minutes, but just switching focus entirely, there's a question in the chat that did catch my eye, which was bringing this right back to the human level. Is how do we ensure that the most vulnerable people don't get left behind by this, and by smart appliances and the evolving world? And a sort of secondary question to that was, you know, sort of the way people interact with the energy system based on whether they're on a prepayment meter or on a credit system. And I think there is always that concern that as technology evolves so quickly, that there is creating division really amongst people.
So I think the technology thing is really interesting, and I think COVID experience is very, very interesting in this. Actually, I think that vulnerability is a lot of different things, right? And actually, in many ways, we've thrown vulnerability into the energy sector when a lot of it really sits with social policy. Right, whether you've got enough money, whether your house is rubbish in terms of insulation, etc.
Yeah.
On the technology thing, it's very interesting what the NHS is doing, and I think healthcare is going to drive much greater penetration. Healthcare and education, because we've been teaching kids at school, you know, at home, but healthcare in particular is going to be rolled out to all people over 60, because in many ways it's a more efficient and effective way of GPs monitoring, but also alerting people to their prescription, etc. So in a weird way, we've got a social policy around health that is going to become create a much more universal access to technology. And I personally think that access to broadband is now an essential service and almost a human right. Okay? So on one hand, we've got that dimension, which I think will create much more universality of access to technology. Yes, there will be people who'll be more fait with technology and those that won't. But fundamentally, as next generations come through, this is not going to happen tomorrow anyway. People will be much more attuned to using technology. But to be frank, I'm not expecting the consumer to be the train spotter. I'm not expecting them to care about their energy. What they want is a service. And it is down to innovative, exciting new business propositions that manage that on behalf of the consumer. So
Absolutely.
I see it as a journey. I also actually see that all these exciting assets should be democratized, and we're coming up with some proposals around how you can access, how you can what's called spread the joy. And that is very much focused on vulnerability.
That is extremely exciting, and I think the fourth D there in the energy transition of democratization is a massive and important part of it, and I'd be hugely excited to hear about your thoughts on that. Laura, I'm conscious we've run slightly over, but I'm so grateful to you because that provides this beautiful context to how far we've come, what the next stages are, and I think particularly how sort of the people that are listening in can play a part in that and be involved. And so I'm hugely grateful for your input and time there. It's been lovely to have you. And I will, at that stage, bring in Rich Hampshire from CGI, who is an expert on this concept of within the energy and utilities market as an ecosystem, an interactive, interoperable ecosystem. And we'll be sort of really excited to hear his thoughts on that. What everybody should know is that Rich is clearly a great skier who skis all manner of scary looking off-piste things. And with that in mind, Rich, please do take us down the slippery slope.
Oh gosh, what a metaphor there! I don't think it is a slippery slope. We're heading upwards, aren't we? But thank you for the introduction, Chris, and thank you, Laura, because I think all the work that you've done with the Energy Data Taskforce probably sets up some of what I'm going to talk about, which is more around the how and the importance of organisations collaborating across the value chain in order to deliver access to data. And clearly, data is a very hot topic in energy, but I want people to think more broadly than that whilst I'm talking as well, because I think a lot of the principles that Laura's talked about go across the board when it comes to intelligent infrastructures. And we see that whilst wires and pipes might move electrons and molecules, Laura touched on the food industry. Well, roads and rail move people and goods, don't they? Including food. We have spectrum and fiber moving ones and zeros, bringing it back to data. So what I'm going to talk about can be applied to any intelligent infrastructure, I believe. And also thank you to Jeremy for the invitation to come and speak with you today. CGI, if you're not familiar with us, are an IT business services organisation. We do a lot of work with utilities, and particularly in the innovation space. But that's probably enough about us. I will move on to what you're here to listen to. Are the slides moving on? He says, wondering. There we go. So for the more technical among you, you might recognize that as being part of the smart grid architecture model. And it's the bit that articulates the physical energy supply chain, be it from upstream gas, the refineries or power stations, the factories of electricity, through the transmission and distribution infrastructure, and down to the demand side, the distribution network, connected energy resources, or behind the meter. We've talked a little bit about the use of energy in buildings, and particularly in domestic premises, with things like freezers potentially being not just food storage devices, but also energy storage devices as thermal batteries, for want of a better description. But we're all familiar with those big physical assets. The beauty of the smart grid architecture model is it also tells us a lot more about what sits beneath the water line, and everything that I've just added there really starts to fit into the digital infrastructure that supports our energy infrastructure. But that's probably more helpful if we label it up a little bit. So I've talked a little bit about the physical piece. What I'll talk about here is the digital piece, and it's this axis at the back. So out on our physical infrastructure, we have a whole host of intelligent devices being deployed, a whole host of sensors which are generating more and more data and giving us more and more visibility of what's going on and helping us to take informed decisions about what we should be doing, be that over the longer term in terms of investment, or be that immediate operational decisions in terms of how we manage the energy system, the amount of energy on the system, or how we manage the infrastructure, the sort of traffic lights that manage the flow of energy. And we've also talked about the devices that are increasingly becoming part of the energy system behind the meter, the intelligent home energy devices, be that the control of an electric vehicle. But critically, if we're going to take those decisions, we need to get access to that data, and that involves connectivity. Laura touched on the increasing integration of the communication networks, the comms providers, with the energy infrastructure, and that's true. We need to transport the data from where it's generated to where it can be used, and then back again to where it can be consumed. Laura, that analogy was just for you. Get consumption back to your food experience. And then in the yellow box, we get into the cloud, we get into the data centers, the technologies that allow the data to be acquired, that manage the devices, the analysis that needs to be carried out on the data, and then making the data appropriately accessible. To one of Chris's points right at the start in the introduction, how do we control access appropriately? How do we give people rights over their data and give them confidence that their data won't be misused and is being used for the purposes for which they've given permission? But let's break that down a little bit more easily and break it down into the creation of data, the generation of data, the movement of data, the acquisition, analysis and access of data, which is obviously the piece that falls to the tech codes like CGI, and then the device manufacturers and the consumers who will be interested in the devices that will actually make use of that data and consume it. But clearly there's a whole ecosystem that needs to work together in order to make that data available from its creation, from the devices, and Jeremy's touched on that and represents the groups that make a lot of these intelligent devices. But critically, there's two organizations or groups of organizations that perhaps are less talked about. One is the investor community themselves. We've touched on it a little bit already today, but we need to attract investment. People need to believe there's a market. People need to see the route to revenue, and they need to understand how they can monetize what they are setting up and building in terms of the infrastructures. And then there's the organizations that will build those infrastructures. And I'm not necessarily just talking here about the transmission businesses, the national grid, or the distribution network operators, all of which are becoming more intelligent, but the organizations that will make use of those core common infrastructures, the electric vehicle charging infrastructure providers, for instance. And then the communication sector will no doubt be eyeing the opportunities in what they used to call machine to machine and today call Internet of Things, the connectivity services for moving the data. The techcos are certainly eyeing the opportunities for data acquisition, analysis and access. But I think the piece that got Jeremy really interested and got me the invitation to come and talk was a piece looking at the breakdown between cost and value. And when we start to talk about intelligent infrastructures, where are the costs? And the bulk of that cost, almost half of it, tends to sit within the generation of the data. So part of that is the actual physical digital devices themselves, but an awful lot of that cost sits with the installation, the building of the digital infrastructure, the deployment of the devices and of the sensors, and then the operation of that digital infrastructure over 10, 15, 20, maybe even longer in terms of years. And then data transport adds about another quarter to that cost, again over the longer term for the serviceability and the data transport from those devices. And then there's the data infrastructure piece, which is typically somewhere between about 5 and 8% of the overall project costs, but is crucial to knitting all of this together. I'd obviously say that because I'm from a techco, but how you make data interoperable, as Laura touched on, how you manage potentially the plethora of standards, how you manage different generations of technologies. We talk a lot in the tech sector about making sure technologies are backward compatible, but I think there's also a piece here about considering designing for forward compatibility as well, and considering that multiple generations of technologies, multiple generations of standards need to coexist. And the way we acquire data and the way we analyze data and give access to data all comes down to those standards that will support that. And then back into the data consumption and making data available back to intelligent devices out on the infrastructure. So there's a difference between where the costs are taken, but a lot of what Laura has talked about was talking about the value that open data can create. And it was, I think it's well displayed on her slide there where it's maximizing value. But for me, the value is realized when data is accessible by those who need it to make informed decisions, be it investment decisions or be it operational decisions. But one of my reflections, because a lot of what we're talking about, and Chris has talked about the Ds, one of my reflections has been the one he hasn't talked about is decarbonisation. And I think a lot of this is being driven by the increased complexity, the dynamics that is coming into our energy system. Now, back in 2006, Clive Humby, the guiding mind behind the Tesco Club Card, so another nod to the food retail sector, I guess, Laura, he described data as the new oil, and some people extended that analogy to the data infrastructure being the new refineries creating value from the crude. I'm not so sure that that's the right analogy today when we talk about data in a world where we're addressing a climate crisis. Laura, I think, stole some of my thunder here, but the analogy that I'm using a lot is that data is the lifeblood of informed decision making. And by that analogy, the heart and the brain are actually the data infrastructure that pumps the data around, makes the data available to where it's needed, and takes those informed decisions. If Foot Anstey are going to circulate the slides, there's a little bit more background on CGI there, but also this hyperlinks to some of the resources that we've made available in the energy sector. You're quite welcome to look at those digitally and save on paper. But that's what I wanted to talk about. Happy to take questions.
Thanks, Rich. That's absolutely fantastic. And just what I wanted to say, brilliant. There have been a few questions just come through, and I'm going to go to Tony's first now, and then I have one for you as well. So Tony's asked, how can we aggregate the many relevant open data sources, and which entity should do this or own it? Then the question obviously is, can open data be put behind a paywall and monetized? At which point I'd argue perhaps it no longer becomes open. Do you want to touch on that? We've just got only a few minutes, and then I want to go back to your slide on data journey. Do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, so gosh, it's a big question, and some of the work that's followed on from the Energy Data Taskforce work around the standards includes different levels of openness, and the Open Data Institute have a framework for this from fully open to having to register and acknowledge that there may be terms and conditions, but the data is free, through to making it commercially available and having commercial terms to monetize that. The real challenge, and Laura didn't touch on it, is really in the data triage and understanding what data can be made open and what value can be generated by making it open, and potentially getting other sources of data opened up to yourself. And the real challenge is then, how do you create value by combining those multiple data sources? There are risks to that around privacy and potentially inadvertent breaches to privacy. But there's real competitive advantage, I believe, to be had from understanding how data sources can be combined to give real, genuine insight. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need some massive central data store. It is about the interfaces and the standards, and also the conditions under which that data is being shared. But it is likely that some form of framework will be required that facilitates access to the data, and people understand how they can get hold of it. And Laura, I don't think you talked about it, but within the Energy Data Taskforce work, you do talk about data discoverability and the data catalogue, who's got what data and where.
So this is this goes to a question from Rosanna, and also one that I had in mind with your data journey slide that you and I have talked about before.
Yeah.
So Rosanna has asked about confidence perspective of data, and the users of data need to understand that the data is not manipulated by vested interests. I want to combine that just with maybe an observation on your data journey slide. One of the things I want to get out of this webinar series is how clear we are on what data we need. I'm concerned that we're running a system at the moment where data providers or generators are providing what data they have, and then people are using that as they can. Isn't that the tail wagging the dog? Shouldn't we say service providers need to identify what data they need and in what formats, and then they send the data generators or providers, meterers, if you like, to go and get it?
I see it as more of a journey, actually, Jeremy, in that we have what we have today, and opening up that is a starting point. I actually thought the question was going to go down the route of understanding data quality and how much confidence can we have in the decisions we're taking based on data that may not be of the top quality. But the thing is, if we start with working with what we have today, we can then start to understand what else we need. What are the data items? And there's no point in asking for things that don't currently exist, because we then have to make investment cases, and we're more likely to be able to make investment cases in putting intelligent devices or sensors out there if we understand the value that's likely to be generated from that, because we know what's missing.
So I think part of the answer to this is, and I'm shoehorning this, if you like, into the next segment. But so part of what we need to do here as a supply chain of products or data or energy or services is to have a look and see where things have been done well. And I think that in this country, we have tried to represent these interests in the policy making and market development. I want to thank you very much, Rich, for this excellent presentation. Once again, we could have talked for much longer. I want to welcome now Rodolphe de Beaufort from GIMELEC from France, who has achieved perhaps some things that we might be slightly jealous of or would want to emulate with regard to placing the interests of the supply chain in the development of policy or markets to enrich this data environment. So thank you again, Rich and Laura, and Rodolphe, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me just take 1 second to share my screen. Yep, should be okay. This way. All right. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, thank you.
All right. So, well, first, thanks a lot for the invitation, because we need to have a lot of humility there, and I have to admit that this all the previous presentation were of very strong interest for me. That there is a lot to share between countries, I believe, and the situation is always interesting to compare between one country to another. So if I present myself, I'm Rodolphe de Beaufort. I'm Deputy Chief Executive of GIMELEC. So what is GIMELEC, by the way? It's very easy. It's an organization which is very similar to what BEAMA is in UK, but we are based in France, as my accent is indicating, and we are quite close. We also have representing 200 companies in the field of the electro techniques and digital technologies. So it's a very transversal technology, which is covering a lot of different aspects, including the network, electricity network, obviously, but as well as intelligence in the buildings, all the intelligence in the industry, what we call Industry 4.0, and as well as the secure power of the data centers. So we are focusing on these 4 main pillars in GIMELEC. And I'm in charge of the network, of the energy networks side, and as well as strategic transversal projects such as data, such as cybersecurity or charging infrastructures for electric vehicles, for example. So that's the situation, and I have and the GIMELEC is also quite active at TND Europe, which is the organization at the European level, which is gathering together the different GIMELECs and BEAMAs, I would say, and there we have a lot of discussion, and this is how I know Jeremy and all the folks, and we have very interesting discussion at that level as well, because it's not only a national issue, it's also a European issue, at least for us in France, as we are still in Europe. But I think there is what is done in Europe has a lot of influence everywhere in the world. So basically, what I would like to talk to you today is basically what we do at GIMELEC on the data topic. So first, the first thing we try to do is to enable the data value of data for our industry. What does it mean? It means that basically our members, historically speaking, are more or less electric asset manufacturers, and this industry is more and more trapped into a market where there is a lot of competition and a lot of price pressure coming from Asian manufacturers. So we really need to evolve into a space where there is more value in order to keep the wealth of our industry and to keep the jobs, I would say, installed in our countries. So this is very important and there is a lot of political interest when we talk about the industrial footprint in our country. And I think that if we want to defend this industrial footprint, we need to go into the digitalization space and we need to enable our markets, I would say for UK market, French market, to be, I would say, friendly with the new data, with the new business models that are based on the data. So this is how we engage the politicians when we tell them, okay, data is a very important topic for two reasons. The first reason is it's going to enable the energy transition. There is no way we're going to integrate that much renewable and new usage on the grid without data. And the other one is we need this data to build value, and we need to keep this value with our industries in order to create jobs in our countries. So this is how we basically engage with key stakeholders. And who are these key stakeholders? The first one in France is the, I would say, is the DSO. We have a very big DSO in France, so it's not like in the UK where you have something like 8 or 10, if I remember well. We have one, which is an EDF subsidiary, and there is a very important thing to know is that we are at the end of the process of a big rollout of smart meters. We are going to roll out 35 million smart meters, and we are more or less around 80% of this rollout today, and it's supposed to be done next year. So we're going to enter in the new world next year where every customer will have the same device in order to meter the data and in order to create this data and then to share the data. So once the assets will be installed within the customer location, really the question is going it's going to create a standard, at least for every customer. And the question will be now, how can we leverage this existing data in order to build services and to create value for everyone? And so behind these meters, we have 700,000 data concentrators that are spread everywhere on the network. And the other question with these data concentrators is, can we use these data concentrators in order to harvest the data, not only from the smart meters, but also from sensors that are spread on the network, and that would allow to add an additional layer of data available for many use cases. So these are the type of conversation we have in France. And you also need to have in mind that in France, we have a kind of tradition for the past 40 years. We used to have 20 million electric water heaters that are controlled by the meters. So our previous generation of meters were not smart, but they were already controlling the water heaters. And this is why we have a kind of mindset where in France, where the control of all the devices at home is more or less seen as something which has to be done through the smart metering infrastructure. Okay, so but this is based for historical reason, I would say. So that's the first main key stakeholders, but then we have also the regulator for obviously it's a very complex area. Each time you arrive with a new business model or new ideas, you have to change either the energy regulation or the standardization or the telecommunication standardization or the public market rules or whatever. So there is a lot of things to do in order to create this this friendly environment for the new data model businesses. And basically, we are also talking a lot to local authorities because the local authorities in France are talking about are the asset owners. Basically, our DSOs are only the operators of these assets, and the local authorities are a key stakeholders in the energy transition planning. So they need to have access to this data as well in order to do this local energy transition planning, and this is why it's an important stakeholder in order to put pressure on the global system in order to have access to the DSO data. So this being said, the last very important stakeholders for us is both the state and the European Commission. So what we have done in the past is a lot of work at the European level in order to try to push awareness about mechanisms like green buttons, which is something that has appeared in the US, and we managed to put this type of principles in the energy winter package of the Energy Commission a few years ago, and now it's supposed to be progressively transposed in national legislation. So we are taking a look at that, and the key point is all the consent mechanisms that allow a customer to give access to its data to either the DSO or service providers in order to facilitate the flow of this data being compliant with the GDPR regulation. So that's a very important point for us as well. Okay, so I would like to share with you a few lessons learned on this journey, because it's just the beginning of the journey in France as well, because we're just really at the beginning. The world will be completely different if we take a look at how fast everything is transforming. I think that in 50 years from now, we won't even recognize the way we consume and manage the energy. But the first thing we've learned when it comes to discussing about data strategy with these different stakeholders, the very important point is to put everyone on a level playing field and make a very precise distinction about what type of data are we talking about. So we have basically four families of data. The first one is the private data, the one which is generated by the meters, for example, or the private assets. And basically this one is secured, protected by the GDPR, and you have a lot of issues based on the consent mechanisms. I was talking about that, and this consent mechanism is not an easy process for the end user. And they need to be comfortable with that if you want to create a service market, basically, because without the consent, you don't have data, and without data, you don't have the market, and you don't have the services. So we need to one blocking point is the acceptance and of the end user of these, I would say, of these consent mechanisms. And one way to facilitate the work is to try to progressively create a convergence between the consent mechanisms of the electricity sector, the gas sector, the heat sector, and eventually the water sector. And in order for the end user to have a very common process, which is the same for every private data, in order to make them comfortable with how to share my data with third parties. And this is an important topic today, and we're just at the beginning, but we already managed to create links between the different operators to make them aware that they should be working on the convergence of their different processes. So that's one important point, and I don't have time to elaborate on that, but it's a very interesting topic. The second family is the aggregated data. So it's basically private data which is aggregated. So you are unable then to identify who is the owner of this data, but the data still has a value because it's the consumption data of a specific area, for example. And here the data can be spread into open data processes and platforms. And here we are working on a set of laws, and we already had a few ones, in order to oblige all the asset owners like the DSO to publish every year a set of data at the local level, in order to build a good awareness of which type of energy is consumed where. And this is very important for the energy transition for local authorities, for example. The third one is the network asset data. So if you have a network, you have a topology, you have assets spread everywhere on the network, it's very important to know where they are for two reasons, basically. One is to understand how you can use flexibility to make economies, you know, and to create a business model for flexibility. And the other one is in order to plan the new assets on the field. You need to understand where are the electric wires. If you want to place a new solar plant, for example, you need to have this type of data. So the objective here is to spread this data into open data platform as well. And we are we start to have a very good representation of the electricity networks on open data platform. And it's still progressing in order to have access to that, even at the low voltage level. And the last one is the operational data. So it's basically the data which is flowing into the SCADA systems of the operators, you know, the state of charge of a transformer, of the lines in real time, etc., etc. And this data is a kind of very confidential data for the operators, because it reflects their know-how about how to operate a network. And so if you start the conversation with a network operator saying, okay, I want to have access to this data, you will have very, very strong reactions, because they want to keep that as a proprietary. And you know, what, in a certain way, it's not the most important part. They have the responsibility of managing the network, so they can keep this data. At least that's the situation in France. So then another key point is to make a clear distinction between the technologies and the business models. Basically, as I was telling you, we have a very strong metering chain in France, which is currently under deployment, but will be ready next year. And basically, this allows to control already a lot of devices through the meters. And these meters, they have one key success factor in order to become to remain, I would say, a key player in this service industry. They are metering I would say the real consumption of the house, of the user. So they have the direct link with the bill of the customer, and it's very difficult to get that through IoT communication chains. But the IoT world is also developing a lot, bringing some additional values such as the real-time, I would say, capabilities, which is not really embedded into metering infrastructures. So, and you have a lot of different business models here that needs to be quite well differentiate, okay? And we have the same problem now starting to pop up between the EV infrastructures, where you can control how the cars are going to charge, and the communication which is embedded into the cars itself. And there you also have some big battles at the moment to influence how the data is going to flow from I would say this car plus charging infrastructure to the network operators. Is it going through the car manufacturer? Is it going to create monopolies in this area? So there is a lot of things to influence in this way, and we believe, obviously, as GIMELEC, that we need to keep this data available and usable at the EV charging infrastructure level in order to create value in the interconnection with the building, with the local networks.
Rodolphe, this is fantastic. Thank you. I've let you go on a little bit, but it was because I couldn't bear to interrupt. This is I'm just going to ask you a quick question about that first, which is, and this is also a discussion that I've been having with John Parsons, is this a national or an international market? And then I want to ask you about the multi-vector data. But first of all, yeah, how is this working?
Yeah, I think that there is, I think that the metering capabilities are clearly national. It's national asset, and it has a very strong influence on how the market is going to develop, and how the value is going to be spread, you know, alongside value chain. And the rest of the technologies, the IoT, the EV charging, the cars, we are in industries that are really, I would say, worldwide markets, you know, with worldwide standards. So as always in the electricity sector, there is a very strong influence of the local infrastructure on the electricity side, which is creating, I would say, slightly strong differences between one country to another. You know,
Yes.
so we need to understand that, because it's not going to be a copy paste from one country to another, even if the technologies of the IoT, of the EVs are going to be the same. So we need to need to be careful.
Perhaps an observation here, as much as a question, is it would be interesting to explore how much the lack of standardization is a barrier to developing this market, and whether the next step is to concentrate on standards, or whether there are other things that we should be doing at the same time or first. I'm also very taken with the way you've described the multi-vector data requirements. We talk a lot in BEAMA about electricity, that's what the E stands for, but we are also, as an organization, trying to progressively converge the processes for thinking about electricity data, gas data, water and heat. I think those present special challenges in themselves, but it's the combination of those four kinds of data that combine to a value service proposition to the consumer, where things get very complicated and maybe most interesting.
Yeah, you're right. If you are a customer, you don't see the electricity as and the gas as two very different things, basically. Both are the combination of both are creating your energy bill. So if you want to create a better system and optimization, you need to have access to data coming from these two silos with a similar quality. You know, otherwise it's going to be very difficult to make an optimization and say, I'm going to consume less gas and plug electricity there. If you don't have the same type of data set, very difficult to build an operational services.
So this is I couldn't have planned this better. This is a beautiful, practical demonstration of exactly what Laura was talking about at the beginning of this session, I think, of how, well, I don't even need to say it, of how it is the consumer experience of this that we need to think about, rather than our own little individual silos of data generation. Rodolphe, thank you again so much. There's so much to learn from what you've said, and we'll review this and think about it. I'm going to hand over to John Parsons now, who is just going to wrap up for us. But can I thank again the speakers? Can I thank everyone who's joined? Special thanks to Chris. It's been great to work with you putting this on, and I'll leave it to others. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, so can I start by thanking all the speakers? I mean, I found that absolutely fascinating. That was really good. And I can also thank the audience, because that's one of the most interesting conversations I've seen going alongside the talks, and quite distracting at times, I have to say, but that was really wonderful, I thought. And a special thanks to Jeremy and to Foot Anstey and for just organising this and making it so good. Just a couple of things I picked up. So I heard a lot about standards, I think, and the need to sort of data quality, all those sort of things. And I'm pretty certain we'll be taking that back into BEAMA, talking to our members, doing some work on that. I picked up on the investors building businesses and the value of data, and again, a whole area to be looked at, I think. One thing I picked up from Rich, I think, was that we're sort of asking what the importance of the supply chain is, what its need is. If you look at the money that's going to be spent on it, I just think it's implicated. It just has to be part of the conversation, I think. But we can follow that up, I think, later on. Rodolphe, very interesting international. I love hearing presentations from other countries, because what I always love is learning what's the same and learning what's different. There's so much you can get from that, but I see a real need for both sharing and learning from other countries, I think, and developing things in common where they can be. Just finished with two themes I just wanted to expand a little bit on. So yesterday I was talking in a webinar on BIM, Building Information Management. So I'm Director Digital. There's two bits to my job. One is product data and how you sort of manage the data about products and how that follows the products through their life. And then you've got all the sort of energy data and how you use all this wonderful data that comes out of products and make things out of it. They're very distinct. But the more I work on them, the big issues are around how you share data between systems. And I just think there's a huge overlap, actually. And increasingly, we should be trying to get some dialogue between those two parties, I think. And it's a comment I think Laura made. But I think the supply chain is just as subject to silos as all the other stakeholders. I think we in BEAMA need to start sort of talking to our members and trying to draw out a lot of the expertise from different areas and somehow try and bring it together. Another point I think I picked up was that we're sort of talking about the supply chain. And again, I think, Lord, this potentially will be just changing the world. So I just think supply chain will be something different in a few years' time. I think all these distinctions will be redundant, I think. So maybe it will be a very different conversation in 10 years' time. Final comment, really, in 1979, I bought my first home computer. It was an XD Sorcerer. Zilog Z80A processor for any technical people. I took it home and I was showing it off to my mates. And one of my friends looked at it, looked at me and said, "What are you going to do with that?" And basically, I think 40 years later, we're just beginning to understand what the answer to that question might be. And my view on this, it's a nightmare for government and regulators. But the whole point of opening this Pandora's box is you do not know what's going to come out of it. The future world is unpredictable. So it's very hard to legislate, because what do you legislate? My view is what you need is principles rather than sort of specifics. And the more I hear, I think the more it's basically we have to follow the consumer value. So whatever increases consumer value is the direction regulators, government should be pushing stuff. Anyway, enough of that. So anyway, Jeremy, what's the next? Can you just pick, when's the next session?
So the next session, which is which should be on the link that you've all seen. So in 2 weeks' time, which is the morning of the 22nd of October, hopefully we will be applying some of this to talk about the data itself, and we will talk about the sources of the data, similar to what we're discussing with Rodolphe just at the end there. What do providers and consumers need? And we are going to touch then on how we standardize its use, but we will save a more detailed technical discussion of data standards, and in particular, a gap analysis of that regulation for session 4. So please do join us in 2 weeks' time. We may look at extending that beyond the hour. We'll have a talk to some of the people who were on the session today, and if we need to go on a little longer, we will. But for the moment, we need to talk about what the sources of data are and how we optimize those. Any other comments, please just email Chris or John or myself or Sarah Sloman, and we will, as I say, we will tailor these sessions to you. We will use the consumer data that we get from you to offer and provide, hopefully, a service tailored to your needs. So, Chris, do you want to add to that? Or?
No, that's exactly well done. We'd love to see you on the next parts of the series with this this bundle of thoughts and data. It's been great today. Thank you ever so much for coming along, everybody, and to Jeremy. It's been emotional.
Great, amazing, inspiration. Thank you again all so much.